Kathleen Jones, a 64-year-old widow, had always believed that family meant everything. It was the foundation of her life, the core of her heart. But when she sat at the kitchen table that morning, looking at the document in her hands, everything she had known came crashing down. "I need you to move out," her daughter-in-law Becky had said 2 days before, her voice cold and detached. "The house is too much for you to handle now. I've made arrangements." The house where Kathleen had spent over 40 years with her late husband, the house where her children grew up, the house filled with memories of birthdays, holidays, and love, it was suddenly no longer hers. All those years of sacrifice, of putting her family's needs above her own, seemed to mean nothing now. Becky had offered her only $200, as though it were some form of charity, a small token to cover the shattered pieces of her life. And there it was in black and white, Becky's name on a piece of paper, next to the house that should have been Kathleen's forever. As Kathleen looked at the document again, she couldn't help but feel the sting of betrayal. The will was clear. Her husband, whom she had loved and cherished for decades, had left everything to Becky, and not a single thought for his own wife. The anger bubbled up inside her, but she remained calm. She had learned long ago that showing anger wouldn't change anything. She had learned to be patient, to stay composed, but this was a betrayal so deep that even her composure felt like it was cracking under the weight of it. Becky thought she could just take everything. Her home, her memories, her life. But what Becky didn't know was that Kathleen wasn't as helpless as she seemed. There was a condition in that will that Becky had clearly overlooked, a small detail that would change everything. Kathleen wasn't going to let her take everything without a fight. The betrayal was far from over, but Kathleen knew she would be the one to get the last word. Kathleen sat in the small, dimly lit living room, staring at the piece of paper in her hands. The house, the one she had lived in for decades, was now in Becky's name. The betrayal felt like a heavy weight pressing on her chest. The memories of her husband George flooded her mind. The years they spent building a life together, raising their children, and creating a home filled with love. Now all of that was gone, handed over to Becky like it was nothing. But there was one detail in the will that kept nagging at her, something Becky hadn't noticed. Kathleen knew this would be the key to regaining control. She couldn't let Becky win. As the days passed, Kathleen's thoughts continued to swirl. She had always been the strong one, the one who kept the family together, even when George was still alive. Now it seemed like everyone had turned their backs on her, even her own son. He hadn't said much during the reading of the will. He had just sat there, silently agreeing with Becky. That silence spoke volumes. Dorothy had always been the one to hold things together, to protect her family. But now, as she sat in the quiet of the house, she realized she had been a fool for trusting them. Becky had moved in without any hesitation, taking over the house and pushing Dorothy aside. It wasn't just about the house, it was about everything that had been stolen from her. The trust, the respect, the love she had poured into this family. Dorothy had raised her children to be strong, to be kind, but somewhere along the way, something had gone wrong. Becky was ruthless. She had been playing the game all along, and Dorothy had been too blind to see it. The betrayal hurt, but it also lit a fire inside her. Kathleen knew she had to fight for herself, for her dignity. The will may have been signed, but that didn't mean it was the end. She had learned over the years that the one thing no one could take from her was her ability to stand up for herself. She wasn't going to let Becky's greed define her life. Kathleen didn't know how she would do it yet, but she was determined to make sure Becky paid for what she had done. This was far from over. Kathleen sat at the kitchen table, her mind racing with thoughts of the will. As the days passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that Becky had taken advantage of her, that her son had abandoned her without a second thought. She remembered the day George had passed away, how devastated she had been. It felt like just yesterday that he was beside her, his comforting presence keeping her grounded. Now she was alone. The house was still the same, but everything had changed. The silence was deafening. Dorothy tried to hold on to the memories, but they were starting to fade, replaced by the coldness Becky had brought into their lives. Becky had never been particularly warm, but now, after everything that had happened, her true nature had become impossible to ignore. Kathleen had always prided herself on being patient, on understanding the complexities of her family's needs. She had always put others first, especially her children. She had been the one to raise them, to provide a safe home, to offer love and support. And yet, here she was pushed aside, as though everything she had done meant nothing. The anger she felt was more than just about the house. It was about everything she had sacrificed. Kathleen knew she couldn't let this go. She had to fight. She had to make sure Becky understood that this wasn't just about money or property. This was about respect. It was about her dignity, about making sure she wasn't treated like an afterthought. Kathleen knew that if she didn't act now, she would lose everything, even the small sense of self-worth she had left. She wasn't going to let that happen. She had spent too many years giving everything to her family to just fade away. She wasn't done yet. As she sat there, a small glimmer of hope began to form in her chest. She had a plan, a way to turn the tables on Becky. The will may have been signed, but Kathleen wasn't finished. There was a loophole, a way to prove that Becky had been dishonest. Kathleen just needed to find it. She wasn't going to sit back and let Becky take everything from her. She would fight for what was rightfully hers, for her place in her own family. Kathleen spent hours sitting by the window, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room. She thought back to the years she had spent with George, raising their children, building a life together. The memories were both comforting and painful. But the one thing that kept haunting her was the silence. It was as though everyone, even her own son, had turned away. Becky had always been distant, but now she was outright cold. Kathleen could feel it every time she entered the room, every time she spoke. It was like Becky's presence had taken over, and there was no place for her anymore. She was a stranger in her own home. But Kathleen wasn't just going to accept this. No, she couldn't. She had given everything to this family. She had worked tirelessly, often putting herself last, for the sake of her children. And now this is how she was treated. Didn't seem right. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that Becky was taking advantage of the situation, using her grief and vulnerability to claim what wasn't hers. Kathleen wasn't going to let that happen. The house may have been in Becky's name, but there was still something left, something that no one could take away. Her dignity, her strength. She wasn't going to let Becky or anyone else strip that away from her. Kathleen knew she needed to act fast. She had already seen the way Becky operated, sly, calculating, always thinking one step ahead. But Kathleen had learned to be patient, to bide her time. And this was no different. She just needed to find a way to outsmart her. The condition in the will, the one Becky had missed, could be her way back. Kathleen had been too careful for too long to let this slip through her fingers. She wasn't going to let a little detail go unnoticed. She would find it. She would take action, and when the time came, she would make sure Becky regretted underestimating her. Kathleen wasn't weak. She wasn't just going to roll over and let her life be taken from her. She had fought for everything she had in this world, and she wasn't about to stop now. Kathleen had never felt more alone than she did in that moment. She walked through the empty house, her footsteps echoing off the hardwood floors, a stark reminder of what she had lost. The silence was overwhelming, the kind of silence that made the walls feel as though they were closing in on her. She walked past the rooms where she had raised her children, where laughter had once filled the air. Now everything was cold, lifeless. As she entered the living room, she could see George's old chair by the fireplace, still there, as if waiting for him to return. But he never would. It was as though all the love they had shared had been taken from her, leaving nothing behind but emptiness. But that wasn't all. Kathleen's mind kept returning to Becky, the woman who had married her son and now seemed to control everything in their lives. It wasn't just the house that Becky had taken. It was the respect, the sense of belonging, the place Kathleen had worked so hard to build for herself and her family. Becky had moved in without a second thought, acting as though she had always belonged here. The more Kathleen thought about it, the more she realized how little respect Becky had for her. She hadn't even bothered to offer an explanation for the way she had treated her. No apologies, no empathy, just cold indifference. And yet, despite everything, Kathleen knew that she had to stay strong. She couldn't let Becky win. She had to find a way to fight back, to take back what was hers. The condition in the will, the one that had been hidden in plain sight, was the key. It was the leverage she needed to turn the tables. But she couldn't afford to rush. She had to be careful, patient. Becky was clever. And if Kathleen made a mistake, it could cost her everything. So she waited. She watched. And every time she saw Becky, every time she heard her voice, Kathleen felt the fire inside her grow. She wasn't going to be ignored. She wasn't going to be cast aside. She was going to fight for her home, for her place in the family. She would make sure that Becky would regret ever underestimating her. Kathleen woke up early the next morning, the sunlight creeping through the curtains as she lay in bed, thoughts swirling in her mind. Today was going to be the day she took the first step. She had spent enough time thinking about her next move, analyzing every angle, and now it was time to act. The weight of the situation still pressed on her chest, but there was a sense of determination that had replaced the feeling of helplessness. She wasn't going to let Becky's cold indifference define her anymore. She knew she had to be smart about it. Becky had underestimated her, assuming that the older woman would simply give up. But what Becky didn't realize was that Kathleen had lived a lifetime of challenges, and she was no stranger to finding strength when it seemed impossible. Kathleen stood up, walking to the kitchen to make her morning coffee. The familiar sound of the coffee maker gave her a small sense of normalcy, even though everything around her had changed. She had raised her children in this house, taught them everything she knew about hard work and integrity, and now she was going to do the same for herself. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about showing her family that she still had control over her own life. After a few sips of coffee, Kathleen grabbed her purse, and with a quiet resolve she headed out the door. She had an appointment with her lawyer today. The papers had been prepared, the evidence gathered, and the plan was in motion. As she drove through the familiar streets, passing by old landmarks that reminded her of better days, Kathleen's thoughts drifted to her son. He hadn't spoken to her much since the will had been read, and every time she thought of him, a pang of hurt shot through her chest. She had given him everything, but now it felt like he had abandoned her, siding with Becky. Kathleen shook her head, trying to push the sadness aside. She wasn't going to let her son's indifference stop her. She couldn't. When she arrived at the lawyer's office, she walked in with confidence. She had done her homework. She had read the will over and over again, finding the small detail that Becky had missed. Now she was going to use it to her advantage. As the lawyer explained the next steps, Kathleen felt a small spark of hope ignite within her. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Kathleen sat in the lawyer's office, her heart pounding in her chest as the lawyer laid out the details of the plan. She had always been the one to handle things quietly, to keep the peace in her family. But now everything had changed. The anger she had been holding back for so long was starting to bubble to the surface. She had always trusted her family, had given them everything, but now they had turned their backs on her. And yet, sitting here with the lawyer, she felt a sense of control that she hadn't felt in weeks. The lawyer explained the legal process, outlining the steps they would take to challenge the will. The condition, the one that Becky had overlooked, was her ticket out of this nightmare. The more Kathleen thought about it, the more certain she became that this was the right move. She had been patient for so long, but now it was time to act. She couldn't let Becky get away with this. The lawyer spoke of the steps that would take place over the next few weeks, how they would gather the necessary documents, and how they would prepare for a legal battle. But as the lawyer spoke, Kathleen couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was doing something for herself. As she left the office, Kathleen felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She had a plan now, and she wasn't going to let anyone stand in her way. She walked out of the building and into the bright sunlight, her eyes squinting as she took in the world around her. It was a small victory, but it was hers. Kathleen knew it wasn't going to be easy. She knew that the battle ahead would be long and difficult. But she also knew that she was ready. She had been through worse. She had survived heartbreak, loss, and the betrayal of those she loved. And now she was ready to take back what was rightfully hers. Kathleen sat at her kitchen table, staring at the stack of papers in front of her. The weight of everything she had been through settled heavily in her chest. It had been weeks since she had met with the lawyer, and the process was moving forward. Each passing day she felt the tension build. Becky had no idea what was coming. Kathleen had done everything she could to remain calm, to keep her composure. She had spent years smoothing things over for her family, making excuses for their behavior. But this time, she wasn't going to play the peacekeeper. This time it was about her. She had been told that the legal battle wouldn't be easy, but Kathleen was prepared. She had spent years caring for others, putting her family's needs first, and now, it was her turn. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about the respect she had lost and the dignity that had been stripped away from her. She couldn't allow that to stand. Becky had made a mistake, and now Kathleen was going to make sure she paid for it. The condition in the will had been a lifeline, something Becky had missed in her greed. Kathleen knew that if she could prove Becky's violation of the will's terms, everything would change. She could feel the momentum building, like a slow tide rising higher with each passing day. As much as she wanted to jump ahead, to confront Becky immediately, she knew that timing was everything. This had to be done the right way. There were still many hurdles to overcome, but Kathleen was ready. She had the documents, the evidence, and the resolve to see this through. As she sipped her coffee, the quiet of the morning filled the space around her, but inside she felt anything but quiet. The calm before the storm. She had always been the one to quietly accept the hard things in life, but not this time. This time she was taking control. She wasn't just going to sit back and let Becky win. She wasn't going to let her own family take everything from her. For the first time in a long time, Kathleen felt a spark of hope. She was going to fight and she was going to win. She wasn't done yet. Kathleen stood in front of the mirror, her reflection showing a woman who had been through a lot, but was still standing strong. The faint lines on her face told stories of years spent caring for others, of sleepless nights and sacrifices made for her family. But today, as she prepared to face Becky, something had changed in her. There was no more fear, no more hesitation. The past few weeks had taught her a lot about herself, about the strength she never knew she had. She had been quiet for far too long, but now it was her time to speak up. The plan was in motion. The lawyer had called the day before, confirming that they had all the necessary documents to confront Becky. Kathleen knew it was time. She had waited for this moment, but when the day finally came, she felt an odd calmness. The house was eerily quiet as she grabbed her purse, the cool morning air brushing against her skin as she stepped outside. She had no idea what to expect when she faced Becky, but Kathleen had prepared herself for this battle. As she drove to Becky's house, her thoughts kept returning to her son. Why hadn't he stood up for her? Why hadn't he said anything when Becky made her move? Kathleen didn't have the answers, but she wasn't going to let it stop her. She couldn't let them think she was powerless. When she arrived at Becky's house, she took a deep breath before stepping out of the car. She could see Becky through the window, moving about the house as though everything was normal. But everything had changed. Kathleen walked up to the front door, her steps steady, her mind focused. She knocked and within seconds the door swung open. Becky stood there, her usual cold expression on her face. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone sharp. Kathleen didn't answer right away. She simply held up the envelope in her hand, the legal papers inside it. Becky's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly masked her surprise with a forced smile. "I don't have time for this," Becky said, trying to shut the door. But Kathleen stepped forward, blocking it with her foot. "I think it's time we talked about what's in here," Kathleen said, her voice calm but firm. Becky hesitated for a moment before opening the door wider. Kathleen could see the unease in her eyes. She knew Becky wasn't prepared for this. The tables were about to turn. Kathleen watched as Becky's expression shifted from confusion to a flicker of panic, but she didn't flinch. Her hand tightened around the envelope she was holding. "I think it's time we had a real conversation," Kathleen said, her voice steady. Becky, trying to regain control of the situation, stepped back into the living room, gesturing for Kathleen to come inside. The door remained open just enough for Kathleen to slip through. As soon as she stepped inside, she could feel the tension in the air. Everything about the place felt unfamiliar, as though Becky had made it hers in every way. The smell of new furniture mixed with the coldness of the space, a stark contrast to the warmth of the home Kathleen had known for so many years. Becky sat on the couch, arms crossed defensively, eyes narrowing. "What's this about?" she asked, trying to maintain her composure. Kathleen didn't waste any time. She placed the envelope on the coffee table between them, sliding it forward slowly. I've been going through the will, Kathleen began, her eyes locked on Becky's. You may have overlooked something. Becky's eyes flickered toward the envelope, but she quickly looked away, as if trying to dismiss it. I don't know what you're talking about, she replied, her voice growing a little more sharp. It's very clear, Becky, Kathleen continued. You think you've taken everything from me, but there's a condition in that will, something you missed. She could see Becky's breath catch for a moment before she masked it with a scoff. You're wasting my time, Becky said, standing up abruptly, clearly trying to assert dominance. But Kathleen remained seated, her posture calm, her gaze unwavering. No, I'm not. You've made a big mistake. And you're about to find out what that mistake costs you, Kathleen said, her tone quiet but forceful. Becky looked at her, unsure whether to laugh it off or to take it seriously. Kathleen could see the wheels turning in Becky's head as the realization started to dawn on her. What do you want, Kathleen? Becky finally asked, the defiance starting to fade from her voice. What I want is simple, Kathleen replied. I want what's rightfully mine. And I want you to understand that this house, and everything else, is not yours to take. Becky hesitated, her mouth opening and closing as though she didn't know how to respond. Kathleen took the opportunity to reach for the envelope, slowly pulling out the papers that would prove Becky's mistake. This was the moment. Kathleen wasn't going to back down. The ball was now in her court. Kathleen watched as Becky's face paled when she saw the documents. She could almost hear the thoughts racing in Becky's mind, trying to figure out how this had happened, how she had missed something so important. Kathleen didn't say anything at first, allowing the silence to hang between them. It was a silence thick with the weight of what was about to unfold. You're making a big mistake, Becky finally spoke, her voice shaking slightly as she reached for the papers. But Kathleen didn't move to stop her. She let Becky take the papers and scan them quickly, her eyes flicking from line to line as if searching for something that would prove Kathleen wrong. But there was nothing. The condition in the will was clear, and there was no way for Becky to deny it now. Finally, Becky dropped the papers back onto the table, her face flushed with frustration and disbelief. You really think you can just take everything back from me? Becky scoffed, her tone rising. Kathleen remained calm. She had expected this. She had known that Becky would try to push back, that she would attempt to deflect the blame. But this was Kathleen's moment. I don't want everything back, Kathleen said quietly, her voice unwavering. I just want what's rightfully mine. And I want you to understand that you can't keep taking advantage of people. Becky's face twisted in anger. You have no idea what you're talking about, she hissed. But the venom in her words didn't have the same bite anymore. Kathleen could see the cracks forming in her facade. For the first time, Becky wasn't in control. And Kathleen wasn't about to let her take back the power. I'm not here to fight you, Kathleen said. I'm here to get what I deserve. And if that means going to court, so be it. Becky's eyes widened. The realization hit her hard. She had underestimated Kathleen, thinking she could just push her aside. But she had made a huge mistake. Kathleen had no intention of backing down now. You may have thought you won, Becky, Kathleen continued, her gaze firm. But this isn't over. I will not let you take everything from me. And I will not let you ruin my family. With those final words, Kathleen turned and walked toward the door. She could feel the weight of the moment settle into her bones. She had taken back control. And as she stepped outside, she felt a surge of determination. This was only the beginning. Kathleen felt a weight lifted as she stepped outside Becky's house, but she knew this was only the beginning. The battle ahead was going to be hard, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a surge of confidence. She had done what needed to be done. She had made her move, and now Becky could no longer ignore the truth. The next few days were a whirlwind. Kathleen went over the details with her lawyer, preparing for the court battle ahead. She spent hours gathering documents, organizing everything she needed to prove that Becky had violated the terms of the will. It wasn't going to be easy, but Kathleen was determined. She wasn't just fighting for her house. She was fighting for the respect that had been taken from her. Becky, on the other hand, was starting to crack. Kathleen could see it in the way Becky avoided her calls, in the way her responses grew more desperate as the days went on. The calm exterior that Becky had so carefully maintained was starting to fall apart. She was no longer in control. Kathleen, however, remained steady. She knew that her patience and persistence would pay off. The court date was set and Kathleen was ready. She didn't know how it would end, but she knew she couldn't back down now. As the day of the hearing approached, Kathleen found herself reflecting on everything she had been through. She thought about George, about the life they had built together, and about the sacrifices she had made for her family. She had given everything to them, and now it was time for them to see that she was more than just the mother, more than just the grandmother. She was a force to be reckoned with. When the day of the hearing finally came, Kathleen felt a calm certainty. She arrived at the courthouse, walked up to the steps, and stepped inside. She wasn't afraid anymore. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. This was her moment, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it away from her.